When German soldiers surrendered in North Africa in 1943, most of them believed captivity would be short, harsh, and humiliating. They had been raised on years of propaganda that described the United States as a decadent, divided nation, incapable of real sacrifice or sustained industrial war. America, they were told, was rich but soft, loud but fragile, impressive on paper yet weak in reality. Defeat at the hands of such an enemy was already painful enough. Being taken prisoner by them felt unthinkable. Yet, as the dust settled in Tunisia and entire Axis formations laid down their weapons, tens of thousands of German troops found themselves under American guard, waiting for a fate they believed would confirm everything they had been warned about. Instead, the first shock came almost immediately. The Americans fed them. Not token rations or emergency meals, but full portions served regularly and without ceremony. Bread was white, not dark or ersatz. Coffee was real. Meat appeared more often than any of them had seen in months, sometimes years. Many prisoners assumed this was a temporary display, a trick meant to soften them before harsher treatment began. But the days passed, and the meals continued unchanged. American guards ate the same food, complained casually about it, and sometimes even discarded leftovers. To soldiers who had learned to scrape pots clean and count calories like ammunition, this casual abundance felt unreal. Then came the transports. German prisoners expected to be moved locally, perhaps to camps in North Africa or Britain. When they were marched toward ports and saw the sheer number of ships waiting offshore, confusion spread through the ranks. The harbors were packed with vessels, not just warships, but cargo ships, transport ships, tankers, lined up as far as the eye could see. Many of the prisoners were veterans of the Atlantic War, men who had watched German U-boats hunt Allied shipping. What they saw now did not match anything they had been told. There were too many ships. Far too many. They boarded Liberty's ships and troop transports that seemed to exist in endless supply. During the crossing, the Atlantic was rough but uneventful. The feared U-boat attacks never came. The convoy moved with confidence, escorted by destroyers that barely altered course. Below deck, German prisoners were housed tightly but humanely. They were not beaten. They were not starved. They were counted, guarded, and otherwise left alone. The most unsettling detail was how routine everything felt. This was not a desperate nation improvising under strain. This was a system running smoothly, predictably, almost casually. When the ships reached American ports, the shock deepened. Instead of ruined docks or chaotic military scenes, the prisoners saw industrial ports operating at full speed. Cranes swung continuously. Trains rolled in and out without pause. Trucks lined up in numbers that defied easy counting. Warehouses stretched for blocks, filled with goods moving in every direction. German soldiers watched civilian workers arrive in their own cars, smoke cigarettes, joke with one another, and leave at the end of their shifts as if the world was not at war. This alone contradicted everything they had been taught about America's internal weakness. The journey inland was worse. They expected freight wagons or cramped transports. Instead, they boarded passenger trains. Real ones. Seats with cushions. Windows that opened. Cars that were heated or cooled depending on the weather. As the trains rolled westward and southward, the prisoners pressed their faces to the glass and stared. Town after town passed by, lit brightly even at night. Streets glowed with electric light. Factories ran after dark. Gas stations shone like beacons in the countryside. There were no blackouts, no shuttered windows, no signs of a population bracing under constant threat. America did not look like a nation under siege. It looked like a nation accelerating. For many of the prisoners, this was the moment the war truly ended. Not on the battlefield, not at surrender, but somewhere between the ports and the camps, as the train cut across a continent that seemed endless. Fields stretched farther than any farmland they had known. Cities appeared suddenly and disappeared just as fast, each one larger than the last. Power plants stood beside rivers, feeding electricity into regions that felt limitless. Factories rose from flat land like metal cities, operating without interruption. There were no bomb craters, no patched walls, no temporary repairs. Everything looked permanent, confident, and untouched. By the time the trains reached the camps scattered across Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, and the Midwest, the prisoners had stopped asking questions. They had seen enough. The camps themselves were orderly, fenced but clean, guarded but calm. Food continued to arrive on schedule. Medical care was provided. Red Cross inspections were routine. Some prisoners even found themselves working on nearby farms or in factories under supervision, earning small wages credited to camp accounts. They wrote letters home describing things they could barely explain, careful with their words, but unable to hide the truth. America was not starving. America was not exhausted. America was not barely holding on. It was producing. And it was producing without pause. For men raised to believe that industrial power was the foundation of victory, the realization was devastating. Germany had gambled on speed, intimidation, and early success. America had responded by turning its entire society into a machine that could not be matched. The German prisoners understood now that no battlefield victory could overcome what they had seen. This was not a country that would negotiate from weakness. This was a country that would simply keep building until the war ended, no matter how long it took. Long before Germany collapsed, many of its soldiers knew the truth. They learned it not from bombs or bullets, but from train windows, factory lights, and the quiet, relentless hum of American industry rolling on without them. Life inside the camp slowly settled into a rhythm that felt almost obscene to many of the German prisoners. Roll calls were regular. Rules were clear. Guards were firm but distant, rarely raising their voices and almost never resorting to violence. The shock was not kindness itself, but how unremarkable it seemed to Americans. The guards did not behave like conquerors savoring victory. They behaved like workers doing a job in a system that ran on schedules and paperwork rather than hatred. For prisoners who had spent years in an army fueled by ideology and fear, this emotional neutrality was unsettling. The camps varied in size, but many housed several thousand men. Barracks were wooden, basic, but dry and weatherproof. Heat appeared in winter, fans in summer. Showers ran regularly. Medical inspections were routine, and sick prisoners were treated without argument. Lice outbreaks were dealt with methodically. Clothing was issued, replaced when worn. None of this felt heroic. It felt administrative. And that, more than anything, was what terrified the prisoners. America did not need to punish them to prove dominance. It simply absorbed them into its system and moved on. Work details soon followed. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be assigned non-military labor, and the United States made full use of it. German soldiers were sent to pick cotton, harvest corn, cut timber, repair roads, and work in canneries and mills. Many expected brutal exploitation. Instead, they found farms larger than entire villages back home, worked with machinery they had never seen, powered by engines that never seemed to fail. Tractors replaced dozens of men. Mechanical harvesters swallowed fields whole. Grain silos rose like towers, filled and emptied with astonishing speed. Farmers often treated the prisoners with a mix of curiosity and practicality. They needed labor. The prisoners worked. That was enough. Some farmers spoke German, descendants of earlier immigrants. Others relied on gestures and repetition. Meals were shared. Coffee was endless. Cigarettes were common. Prisoners noticed how American civilians wasted things without guilt. Food scraps went into bins. Broken tools were replaced rather than repaired. Trucks were abandoned when engines failed, left to rust rather than stripped for parts. To men trained to salvage everything, this casual disposability felt obscene. Factories left an even deeper impression. Prisoners assigned to industrial work watched assembly lines operate with hypnotic efficiency. Raw materials entered at one end. Finished products emerged at the other. Workers specialized in single tasks, repeating them endlessly without complaint. Parts fit perfectly every time. Machines ran day and night. There was no sense of improvisation or scarcity. Everything had a place. Everything had a backup. If one line slowed, another picked up the slack. German prisoners who had worked in bomb-damaged factories back home understood immediately what this meant. You could not bomb this into submission. You could slow it, but you could not stop it. What disturbed many prisoners most was the absence of visible sacrifice. American civilians complained, but not about hunger. They complained about gasoline rationing, about sugar limits, about not getting the newest cars or appliances. These complaints sounded absurd to men who had watched cities burn and families starve. Yet, even with rationing, American stores overflowed. Clothing was plentiful. Shoes were solid. Radios played constantly. Movies continued. Baseball games filled stadiums. The war existed here, but it did not dominate life. It ran in parallel, fueled by production rather than desperation. German prisoners talked among themselves endlessly, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had believed. Some clung to ideology, insisting America lacked the will to fight long wars. Others quietly admitted the truth. The United States had not entered the war to prove superiority. It had entered to apply pressure, slowly and irresistibly, until resistance collapsed. Every trainload of supplies, every convoy, every factory shift reinforced the same message. This war would not be decided by courage alone. It would be decided by output. Letters home became complicated. Censors read everything. Prisoners learned to speak carefully, but the message still slipped through. They wrote about food, work, weather, and strange abundance. Families back in Germany read between the lines. If the enemy could feed prisoners better than Germany fed civilians, something was deeply wrong. Some letters were never delivered. Others arrived months late. But rumors spread regardless. American camps were not hell. They were unsettlingly normal. The psychological impact of this realization grew over time. Prisoners who had once dreamed of escape lost interest. Where would they go? Across a continent this vast, this organized, this secure? Others began learning English, not out of affection but curiosity. They listened to radio broadcasts, overheard civilian conversations, and pieced together the scale of the war effort. Numbers alone were staggering. Tens of thousands of aircraft produced each year. Ships launched faster than enemies could sink them. Entire factories built from scratch in months. Germany had built wonders under pressure, but America built systems that eliminated pressure entirely. Even discipline felt different. Infractions were punished, but not cruelly. Solitary confinement existed, but beatings were rare. Executions non-existent. The authority of the guards came not from fear, but from confidence. They knew the prisoners were contained not just by fences, but by distance, logistics, and overwhelming control. Escape was theoretically possible. Practically, it was absurd. As the war dragged on, news filtered in. Sicily, Italy, Normandy. Each announcement carried weight. Prisoners compared dates and distances, realizing how quickly American forces moved once committed. Equipment appeared in Europe faster than German intelligence believed possible. Tanks arrived in numbers that erased tactical victories overnight. Aircraft losses were replaced almost immediately. The American war machine absorbed casualties without flinching. For many German prisoners, the greatest humiliation was not defeat, but clarity. They saw too late what their leaders had misunderstood. War against an industrial superpower was not a test of bravery. It was a math problem, and the numbers had never been in Germany's favor. By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine, many prisoners no longer spoke of victory or revenge. They spoke of survival, of returning home, of rebuilding. They knew now that the world after the war would not belong to those who fought hardest, but to those who could build fastest. And America, in its quiet, relentless way, had already won that race long before the final shots were fired. As months passed, the camps themselves became strange microcosms of a defeated army living inside the very system that had destroyed it. German prisoners organized their own internal hierarchies, elected spokesmen, formed work groups, and even staged theatrical performances. The Americans allowed most of it. Order inside the wire was easier when prisoners managed their own routines, and the Geneva Convention encouraged such autonomy. But for many Germans, this freedom only deepened the psychological blow. They were allowed to behave like soldiers without being soldiers anymore, stripped of purpose but surrounded by efficiency. Political divisions among the prisoners sharpened quickly. Hardcore Nazis tried to enforce ideological discipline, intimidating others, keeping track of who seemed too friendly with guards or too impressed by American life. In some camps, these men held mock tribunals, beat fellow prisoners, and even murdered those they considered traitors. The Americans responded with a methodical solution rather than panic. Suspected extremists were quietly separated and transferred to isolated camps. Informants were protected. Investigations were conducted with paperwork and interviews, not reprisals. Once again, the system absorbed the problem rather than exploding over it. The existence of anti-Nazi prisoners stunned many Americans. Jewish Germans, political dissidents, and conscripts who had never believed in Hitler suddenly spoke freely. Some broke down when describing why they had fought. Others admitted they had been trapped by fear, by propaganda, by the simple momentum of war. For guards and officers, this complicated the idea of the enemy. The men behind the wire were not monsters. They were products of a machine that had consumed them and failed. Re-education programs began quietly in late 1944. The United States did not announce them loudly or frame them as punishment. Instead, they were presented as opportunities. Prisoners were shown films about American history, democracy, and industry. Later, they were shown footage of liberated concentration camps. The reactions varied. Some refused to watch. Others claimed the images were fake. But many stared in silence, confronted with evidence they could no longer dismiss. The horror was not just what had been done, but how completely they had been kept from seeing it. Books appeared in camp libraries. Newspapers were distributed. Debates erupted in barracks late into the night. Men argued about responsibility, guilt, and the future. Some clung desperately to the belief that Germany had been betrayed, not defeated. Others accepted the truth with crushing resignation. The industrial might that had fed and housed them now exposed the moral vacuum at the center of the regime they had served. Meanwhile, American civilians continued their lives with casual indifference to the presence of enemy soldiers in their midst. Towns near camps saw prisoners marching to work details daily, singing, joking, sometimes even waving. Children watched from fences. Some farmers trusted prisoners alone with equipment worth more than entire German villages. Escapes were rare, and those who tried were usually caught quickly, not by guards, but by geography. There was nowhere to hide. No sympathetic population. No underground network. The sheer scale of America made resistance feel meaningless. The end of the war in Europe arrived not with explosions in the camps, but with announcements. Loudspeakers crackled. Guards assembled formations. Prisoners listened as surrender terms were read aloud. Some collapsed. Others stood rigid, faces blank. A few cheered quietly, relieved it was finally over. The feared reprisals never came. Instead, life continued much as before, only now without the illusion of eventual return to battle. News from Germany grew worse. Cities lay in ruins. Infrastructure shattered. Families displaced or dead. Letters home became desperate. Prisoners realized they were safer behind American wire than their loved ones were in Europe. Food parcels from the Red Cross often flowed from America to Germany, not the other way around. This inversion of expectations broke something deep inside many men. Victory no longer felt stolen. It felt earned by a nation that could outproduce and outlast an entire continent at war. Plans for repatriation took time. Millions of prisoners could not simply be shipped home overnight. In the meantime, camps became places of waiting and reflection. Some prisoners married American women they had met through work details or church contacts, relationships initially forbidden but increasingly tolerated as the war receded into memory. Others prepared themselves mentally for return to a homeland that no longer resembled the one they had left. American officers noticed something remarkable. Many German prisoners did not want to leave, not because they loved captivity, but because they feared the collapse awaiting them at home. In America, systems worked. Rules were predictable. Food existed. The future, though uncertain, seemed possible. In Germany, everything was rubble and questions. When repatriation finally began, prisoners boarded ships with mixed emotions. They carried memories that would haunt them for life. They had seen the enemy up close, not as caricature, but as a functioning civilization. They had learned that power did not always shout. Sometimes it hummed, quietly, through factories, farms, and logistics networks that never slept. Many would return to Germany changed men. They would help rebuild not just cities, but ideas. Some became engineers, managers, teachers. They spoke of America with a strange mixture of resentment and admiration. They had lost the war, but they had learned why. And for those who would later tell their children about captivity, the story rarely began with guards or fences. It began with the first meal, the first factory, the first moment they realized the war had been over long before they were captured, decided not on battlefields, but on assembly lines stretching farther than they could see. As the months stretched on, the camp slowly shifted from places of confinement into holding zones for a defeated generation waiting for history to decide what would come next. By late 1945, the shock of survival had faded and been replaced by something heavier: reflection. German prisoners were no longer trying to understand how they had lost. They were trying to understand who they were without the war. The American re-education effort intensified, but not through lectures or punishment. It worked through exposure. Prisoners were given uncensored newspapers describing the Nuremberg trials, the dismantling of the Nazi state, and the revelations pouring out of Europe. Many read about Auschwitz, Dachau, and Buchenwald for the first time while sitting on wooden bunks in Oklahoma or Arizona. Some rejected the reports outright, insisting they were Allied propaganda. Others stared at the pages until the words blurred, struggling to reconcile what they were reading with the oaths they had once sworn. Arguments broke out constantly. Barracks divided along invisible lines. Former believers and former skeptics clashed over guilt and responsibility. Was obedience a crime? Was ignorance an excuse? These were not academic debates. They were personal, cutting straight through years of indoctrination. Men who had once marched in formation now argued late into the night about morality, truth, and silence. The industrial might that had fed them now forced them to confront the consequences of the system they had served. American guards noticed a change. The swagger was gone. The rigid posture softened. Many prisoners began asking questions about American life that had nothing to do with war. How did unions work? Why could workers criticize their bosses openly? How did elections actually function? The answers were not always flattering or simple, but they were given honestly. The contrast between this openness and the secrecy of Nazi Germany became impossible to ignore. Work details continued, but now they felt different. Prisoners rebuilt roads, harvested crops, repaired infrastructure, and assisted in industries that had nothing to do with weapons. For some, this was the first time labor felt productive rather than destructive. They were no longer fueling a war machine. They were sustaining communities. That realization, quiet and slow, reshaped how many viewed their own past actions. Letters from home grew more frequent, but also more desperate. Germany was starving. Cities were flattened. Families were scattered across occupation zones. Prisoners sent back money earned from camp labor, small amounts by American standards, but life-saving in ruined towns. The irony was impossible to escape. Men captured by the enemy were now supporting their families better than they could have as free citizens of the Reich. Some prisoners were transferred to Britain or France for labor reconstruction before eventual release. Those who remained in the United States watched as camps slowly emptied. Barracks once packed with men fell silent. Roll call shortened. The wire fences remained, but the urgency was gone. Guards treated prisoners less like enemies and more like guests waiting for transport. The psychological impact of America's scale never faded. Former POWs would later recall how trains arrived on time, how stores stayed stocked, how machines replaced backbreaking labor. They spoke of a country that could fight a global war without collapsing at home. The lesson was brutal and unforgettable. Germany had not been outbraved. It had been outproduced. When prisoners were finally told they were going home, reactions were mixed. Some celebrated openly. Others fell quiet, knowing they were returning to hunger, rubble, and shame. A few openly wept, not because they loved captivity, but because captivity had been predictable. The world beyond the fence was broken. Departure days were orderly. Americans shook hands with former enemies. Some guards posed for photos. There were no speeches, no triumphal gestures, just paperwork, transport trucks, and quiet goodbyes. The war was over, and vengeance had no place left to go. As ships carried German prisoners back across the Atlantic, they carried more than men. They carried first-hand knowledge of what a fully mobilized industrial democracy looked like. They carried the memory of a country that had not needed brutality to prove its strength. They carried the unsettling realization that the enemy they had been taught to despise had treated them with restraint, structure, and consistency. For many, this knowledge would become a burden. It complicated old beliefs. It shattered excuses. It forced comparisons that could not be undone. The myth of German superiority did not survive the trip home. Years later, when former POWs were interviewed, many struggled to explain the experience. They spoke of defeat, yes, but also of awakening. They had arrived in America expecting cruelty and chaos. Instead, they found order, abundance, and a system that functioned even under the strain of global war. The shock was not that America was kind. The shock was that it worked. And that realization followed them long after the camps disappeared, after the fences were torn down, and after the war became history instead of memory. When the ships finally docked in Europe and the former prisoners stepped onto ruined soil, the contrast was devastating. America had been loud, vast, and alive with motion. Germany was silent, fractured, and exhausted. Cities were fields of broken stone. Rail lines twisted like snapped bones. Factories that once fed the war effort stood hollow, looted, or burned out. For many returning POWs, the sight was not shocking because it was unexpected, but because it confirmed what they had already come to understand while imprisoned. The war had not simply been lost on the battlefield, it had been lost in the realm of capacity. The men who returned were changed in ways their families often struggled to understand. They spoke differently. They questioned authority openly. Some had learned English. Others brought back technical skills picked up on American farms and construction crews. A few returned with money, clothes, or tools sent by American employers who had grown to trust them. These were not symbols of collaboration. They were reminders that the world they had fought against had moved forward while Germany had collapsed inward. In post-war interviews and memoirs, former POWs repeatedly returned to the same memory: scale. They described highways that never ended, factories that ran day and night, farms larger than entire German villages, and cities that glowed even during wartime blackouts in Europe. The United States had not merely fought Germany. It had overwhelmed it with logistics, organization, and production. This realization cut deeper than any battlefield defeat. For some, this understanding bred resentment. They argued that Germany had been crushed not by courage, but by material excess. For others, it became the foundation of a new worldview. They began to question the ideology that had promised dominance through willpower alone. America's industrial might revealed the lie at the heart of Nazi propaganda. Belief could not replace infrastructure, and fanaticism could not substitute for fuel, steel, and food. The long-term effects of the POW experience rippled through post-war Germany in subtle ways. Former prisoners became teachers, engineers, union organizers, and business owners. Some quietly applied American methods they had observed, streamlined workflows, decentralized management, and pragmatic problem-solving. Others carried a deeper lesson, that systems mattered more than slogans. These ideas did not rebuild Germany alone, but they influenced the mindset of a generation tasked with starting over from nothing. Not all memories were positive. Many prisoners carried guilt that never faded. They had survived while others had died. They had eaten while families starved. They had lived safely behind wire while Germany burned. This survivor's guilt haunted men who had expected punishment and instead received stability. The kindness they encountered sometimes felt heavier than cruelty would have. American records show that discipline problems among German POWs dropped steadily the longer they remained in the United States. Suicide attempts declined. Violence between prisoners decreased. Even Nazi loyalists gradually lost influence. This was not the result of force. It was the result of environment. The American system did not crush dissent, it absorbed it, neutralized it through routine, accountability, and exposure to alternatives. The irony was unavoidable. Germany had sent its soldiers across Europe as conquerors, only for many of them to be defeated most thoroughly while confined thousands of miles away, watching an enemy society function without fear, without collapse, and without ideological obsession. The POW camps became unintended classrooms in how modern power actually worked. By the early 1950s, many former POWs would immigrate to the United States legally. They returned not as prisoners, but as workers, citizens, and neighbors. They built homes near the very camps that once held them. They raised children who spoke English without accents and learned about the war from textbooks rather than memory. Few spoke openly about their captivity. Those who did rarely framed it as suffering. They framed it as revelation. American veterans, too, remembered the POWs. Some recalled initial hatred that slowly dissolved into familiarity. Others admitted they had never expected the enemy to look so ordinary. The shared experience of work, routine, and conversation eroded caricatures on both sides. The war ended not with reconciliation, but with something quieter and more enduring: recognition. History often frames victory in terms of battles won and enemies destroyed. The story of German POWs in America reveals another dimension of victory, one achieved through capacity, organization, and restraint. The United States did not need to terrorize captured soldiers to prove its strength. Its factories, farms, and railroads did that every day. For the prisoners, the shock was not merely that America was powerful. It was that this power was normalized. It did not rely on fear or spectacle. It relied on systems that worked whether or not anyone was watching. That realization reshaped how many former enemies understood the modern world. In the end, the barbed wire came down, the camps vanished, and the guards went home. But the impression left behind did not fade. It lived on in memory, in post-war reconstruction, and in quiet acknowledgments that the war had been decided not just by bullets and bombs, but but by the ability to sustain effort without collapse. German POWs arrived in America expecting brutality and decay. What they encountered instead was a nation whose greatest weapon was not its guns, but its capacity to produce, organize, and endure. That shock, more than captivity itself, stayed with them for the rest of their lives.